So on that note, it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Dr. Jessica Melbourne-Thomas from CSIRO. So Jess is a transdisciplinary researcher with CSIRO Oceans Atmosphere, and previously a research scientist and project leader with the Australian Antarctic Division and the Antarctic Climate Ecosystem CRC. Jess gained a PhD in quantitative marine science from the University of Tasmania and also spent 2 years as a Rhodes Scholar at the University of Oxford. In 2015, Jess was named Tasmania's Young Tall Poppy of the Year. I didn't even realise that we had a Young Tall Poppy of the Year, but that's a great award, and it was for her research, science, communication and policy engagement. In 2017, Jess was named one of Science and Technology Australia's 30 STEM superstars and was a finalist in the Women's Agenda Leadership Awards. In 2019, Jess was awarded an Alumni Achievement Award from the University of Tasmania for her distinguished service in the fields of Antarctic marine ecosystems and climate change research. And Jess, in all her spare time, co-founded the Women in Polar Science Network with over 3,800 members worldwide, and significantly, very significantly, she was one of 12 women scientists globally to have her portrait featured as a constellation on the ceiling of New York's Grand Central Station as part of General Electric's 2017 Balance the Equation campaign. Locally, Jess is also co-founder of the Homeward Bound program, which we'll talk a little bit about today, which is an Australian-led global initiative to foster women's leadership in science. So on that note, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Jess Melbourne-Thomas to the dais.
Thanks very much, Tim, and thank you so much, everyone, for having me here today. I'm really honoured to have been asked. I'd also like to start by paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land that we meet on, and my respects to their elders, past and present. So in 2013, I went to Antarctica for the first time on a multidisciplinary sea ice research cruise, and as is often the case on that kind of expedition, we ended up being stuck in the sea ice for a number of weeks, and we just had to kind of sit tight and wait for the ice to open up a bit, and so that we could the ship could get out. And as you can imagine, that was fine by everybody involved. There was heaps to see and look at and study when we went out on the ice every day to work on our science projects. And one beautiful day we were out working on the ice, and a minke whale popped its head up through a thinner patch in the ice to take a breath, and hung around for quite a long time. It was really an amazing thing to be part of. Here's a picture of that whale here. And I was going to tell you the story about me getting a bit too excited about this whole experience and falling through the ice into the freezing cold water. And then my claim to fame being that I've swum with a minke whale in Antarctica. But I was talking to somebody just outside this morning about the other thing that happened when we had this experience with the whale, and that was that we had stuck a GoPro on a big pole down through the ice to see if we could get some footage of the whale. I didn't include it here because it was a little bit low quality, but what we were able to capture on that footage, coincidentally without being able to see what we were filming, was actually the whale doing a poo underneath the ice. And as a marine ecosystem scientist, that's really fascinating because we know that whale poo is vitally important in helping to fertilise the Southern Ocean, which is where phytoplankton productivity is limited by the micronutrient iron, and whale poo is incredibly high in that micronutrient. But we didn't really have any evidence about whether whales did that underneath sea ice, which is also an area where there's a lot of phytoplankton productivity. So the reason I decided to substitute my stories a bit is because I think it's kind of a neat example of some of the things that Tim talked about, and we've also heard about this morning, around innovation, taking risks, making the most of opportunities to make kind of breakthroughs in terms of our understanding of these systems. So I've been very, very fortunate to spend most of my life being close to nature. I grew up diving and bushwalking in Tassie. I've been very fortunate to dive on reefs around the world for work, and that lifestyle has changed a little bit in recent years, juggling work and two small children, but I very much hope that, that my two girls are able to develop that same bond with the ocean and with the natural environment that I've been so lucky to have. I'm also deeply concerned about what their future will look like in a rapidly changing climate, and that's something that I'm going to talk about this morning. So I've borrowed and paraphrased this statement from some work that I'm doing with a group of women leaders in Hobart at the moment, and it says that we need leadership that stems from a new paradigm that embraces connection, values wisdom, cares for the planet and our children and grandchildren's future. And to be totally honest, 10 years ago I probably would have screwed up my nose at this kind of fluff, but the more that I have worked in the leadership space, the more that I've learnt about the effects of climate change, and the more I've thought about what we need from decision making, plus having my own children and being worried about the future, the more I think that this actually is a really important message. And I also think that diversity in leadership, including gender equality, is fundamental to achieving that new kind of leadership. So as Tim mentioned, in 2014 I co-founded a program called Homeward Bound, which is a global leadership initiative set against the backdrop of Antarctica, which is aiming to heighten the impact and influence of women in making decisions that affect our planet. So in 2016, the inaugural Homeward Bound program culminated in taking the largest ever all-female expedition to Antarctica, and since that time there have been 2 more voyages, each with about 100 women, and there's a 4th one departing in November this year. So the central tenet of Homeward Bound is that we simply can't afford to have so few women in senior decision-making positions where really critical decisions are being made about how we address climate change and other global challenges. Not only are we missing half the voice at the leadership table, we're also missing the strength that comes from diversity in viewpoints and approaches. And I think that the STEM fields really exemplify many of these problems, particularly given the key role that STEM and STEM practitioners will play in finding ways to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So most of the work that I do as a research scientist is on trying to understand the effects of climate change on the marine environment and considering ways in which industry, policy and decision makers and also communities can adapt to these effects. So as you might be aware, Antarctica is a really key part of the climate change story. Antarctica and the Southern Ocean play a key role in regulating the global heat budget and also drawing carbon dioxide down from the atmosphere. Antarctic ice cores, by storing tiny bubbles of air over many thousands of years, have been key to providing us with long-term climate records to better understand current rates of change. And the area that I work in, Antarctic Ecosystem Research, is really important because Antarctic ecosystems in many ways are sentinels of the effects of climate change in the marine environment, and parts of Antarctica are warming at some of the fastest rates that we're seeing anywhere on the planet, and that's already having quite significant impacts for the species that live there. So I recently gave a talk on Antarctica and climate change to a group of 100 school children, and I played them some Antarctic sounds and they absolutely loved it, and I thought it might be worth including them here too, just to give you a little bit more of a kind of immersive feel for what it's like to be in Antarctica and to work there. So the first sound is a black-browed albatross. and this is an emperor penguin sneezing. This one, the next one was a favourite with the school kids. This is a Weddell seal yawning. And finally, the sound of a Weddell seal calling underwater. So there you go, that's your Antarctic experience for this morning. Over the last 2 years, I've been working as a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and following the steep learning curve around how the IPCC summarises and synthesises the science that's done globally to try to distill succinct assessments of the current and likely future impacts of climate change. And as you're probably aware, the IPCC reports really clearly demonstrate not only that we're already locked into a certain amount of future climate change because of the inertia in the climate system, but also that if we don't act very urgently to address the risks and impacts that are already emerging because of climate change, then we face a very dangerous future for nearly all aspects of society and the environment. So I put in these an example of these burning embers plots, which you may have seen before. They've kind of become a signature of the IPCC reports. And they show how different levels of global warming affect impacts and risks for natural, managed and human systems. So yellow is a moderate level of risk, red is high risk, and purple is a very high risk of severe impacts. So I might use the laser. The grey bar here is the 2006 to 2015 period, and then the two lines represent 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees of warming relative to pre-industrial conditions. So the model projections are indicating that we will reach 1.5 degrees of warming by around the year 2030, and you can see that even at that level of warming we're straying into the high to very high risk level across many of these different systems, and some here that are probably of interest in particular for this audience. So a project that we're running at the moment is inviting questions in partnership with the ABC, inviting questions from the Tasmanian public around what they are most interested and concerned about with respect to climate change, and then we're doing a road trip around the state to address some of those questions. My background, as I said, is in marine ecosystem research, and particularly as an ecosystem modeller, and the work that my colleagues and I have been doing and that we're contributing to this project and also through the IPCC is in trying to use models as flight simulators to not only assess what the future might look like under a climate change for Antarctica, for Tasmania, for Australia and globally, but also to compare some of the options that we have for addressing those changes together with some of the other direct human impacts that we need to manage, like fisheries and pollution. So a month ago, I landed myself a shiny new job at CSIRO as a transdisciplinary researcher and knowledge broker. It's a big mouthful of a title, and I'm in the process of figuring out exactly what that will mean, but it's very much looking at trying to move beyond just the science to try to better engage with stakeholders to design projects and deliver outcomes that strengthen the connections between science, policy and practice. And in getting my head around some of the things that requires, I've come across this knowledge, values, rules framework that I found particularly helpful, and which emphasises that in decision making it's not enough just to have the information about a problem. We also need to be in the space where people's values are aligned, and also where the rules and regulations that are in place actually allow a decision to be made. it was really great to hear from Rod and others that the water industry is certainly thinking a lot in this values space as well. And I do think that more and more we're finding that it's not enough just to increase knowledge, that we do need to be thinking about how people's values affect outcomes, and also possibly thinking about how we can change the rules. In saying that, I certainly don't mean to belittle the value of science. I think that science is probably more important than ever before in informing the way that we make decisions. And one of the things that we do know is that more diverse scientific teams, just like more diverse leadership teams, in bringing different viewpoints and approaches and ways of thinking, actually deliver better outcomes. And there was a great article in The Conversation a couple of years ago now describing the evidence that we actually do get better scientific outcomes from more diverse teams. And yet the senior levels in all STEM fields are still male-dominated, and in Australia there's a 60% attrition rate for women from entry-level science through to senior positions. And so we have this significant problem of how do we fix the leaky pipeline. There are things that are changing, and there are lots and lots of great initiatives around to create opportunities for women and try to level the playing field. But even so, if we project out, given current rates of change, we're still looking at the 100-year timescale to actually see equality for men and women in the workplace. The last time I gave a conference opening address, it was with my 4-month-old at the time in the baby carrier. You can see a little face there. I wasn't brave enough to try to recreate that today. Now she's a bit older and a bit more mobile. And I have to admit that it's been a fairly interesting journey for me over the last couple of years, trying to juggle a career and young children. But as I indicated, there's a lot that's being done by institutions and in workplaces to allow people to better juggle caring responsibilities and work, and also to address some of the issues that are specific to women, things like flexible working arrangements, mentoring programs, and ways to address unconscious bias and encourage women to apply for more promotions. But I think the message is that we can't rest on our laurels, because there is still so much to be done, and if we don't fix it, then we're all ultimately disadvantaged. So to sum up, I think we have some rough seas ahead, particularly in achieving diversity and equality in science and leadership, and in addressing the global challenge of climate change. And importantly, I think that the second very much depends on the first. If we're going to address these global challenges, we need to fix the diversity issue. So there are some significant barriers to break through, just like this sea ice here, but I think that if we act now, it is achievable. So thanks again for having me here this morning.
Thanks, Jess. Any questions for Jessica this morning? Now, Andrew has a microphone. If you could just take the microphone, just up behind you up here, Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks very much, enjoyed that. Really simple one. Are you part of the Curious Climate Roadshow with the ABC?
Yes, but with the restriction of small children, so the roadshow bit for me will be being part of the Hobart event.
Okay, thank you. Yep. I've got a daughter that would be very interested in listening, but we're in Launceston, so I'll just...
Oh, right. Oh, fantastic. There will be a Launceston event that will be great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Actually, I've got 2 questions. Both are quite different. One is, it's quite similar in engineering, which is part of STEM. What are the, in terms of attrition rates for female engineers? Do you have any ideas about what's causing the attrition? And the other question is, in Tasmania specifically, what do you see as the main challenges that come out of climate change? I mean, is it water shortages? Is it rising tide levels? Is it the temperature? Because we seem like we're quite a unique little landmass that isn't getting the droughts that Queensland's getting, but obviously there must be something that's going to hit first.
Yeah, they're great questions. I don't know the statistics for engineering, but there's a great report that came out, I think a couple of years ago now, from the Office of the Chief Scientist that summarised all the data, and it has a heap of great infographics on the attrition rates for different fields within STEM, and I think it's even higher than 60% for engineering, but it also looks at what some of the causes might be, and it delves a little bit more into diversity more generally. In terms of the causes, I think it's a complex problem, and sometimes it's specific to particular fields, but certainly I see a lot of women drop out at the age where they decide to have kids and figure that it's just too hard to juggle everything. I think that's part of the picture, but also there are definitely some real challenges in things that we can fix in the way that positions are advertised and the way that women are encouraged to apply for promotions and more senior positions. So there's definitely stuff to do there. In terms of the climate change, key climate change issues for Tasmania, I have a little bit of a marine bias in my thinking, and from that perspective, things like heat waves are going to be a really significant impact on marine productivity and fisheries. I think on land and actually in the ocean too, part of the problem will be the cumulative impacts. So it'll be, increased frequencies of extreme events. It'll be greater fluctuations in availability of water and other resources, and those things together and the impacts that they have on infrastructure and other things will probably be the biggest challenge, but I might not be the best person to answer that question.
Thanks.
Any other questions? No?
Perhaps I could ask, just to continue on in that theme, thinking of our fish farming industry. So what comments do you have there about the potential effects, considering that's such a significant industry in Tassie?
So my husband is a fish farmer at the moment, and so I have a little bit of insight through that lens, but as disclosure, certainly temperature increases will be an issue and they already are for aquaculture from what I understand. And I think being flexible about moving offshore and those kinds of options are what that industry is looking at. But more generally, a lot of the work that my colleagues are doing is indicating that we will have an increasing reliance on food from aquaculture for global food security, and so thinking about ways that we can be more flexible in considering climate change impacts in nearshore marine environments and what implications that has for aquaculture productivity is going to be really important.
Oh, one more, sorry.
Hi, Jess. My question relates to your view on how we can transform society's view of community action from being viewed as the radical, disregarded as much as possible element to one that is well-founded on purpose and intent, and very often the science behind climate change. Because we're suffering from inaction at government, we're suffering from inaction at different tiers of government and in all tiers of industry even to take meaningful action. Community groups that bring the topic to the table are then disregarded as being radical. How do we change that?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I think a really important issue. And in fact, some of the conversations I've had recently with colleagues have been around the fact that the wealth of knowledge that is in communities and understanding of climate change effects that are in train and autonomous adaptation to those effects, and views and opinions on thoughts about potential different futures at the local level. And so being able to tap into that, I agree, is really fundamentally important. I'm less clear on how we change the viewpoint that that's radical and invaluable. I'm not sure that that's, certainly from a science perspective, I'm not sure that's always the case. A lot of social scientists I work with see that as kind of, you know, their bread and butter, those community views and the drive that comes from local communities for change. But I'm not sure what we do kind of at the higher level to change the way people think about that information. Thanks.
One more.
Just a question about how we tackle the question about climate change and the communication about it. There's been a change in the way that we've been approaching it. Rather than saying we're trying to save the planet, it's been more financial. There's a cost involved in not acting. It doesn't seem to be working either. What's your opinion about how we should frame the argument with governments? Should it be the save the planet or financial? What's your thoughts?
That's another really good question. I suspect it will continue to have to be a bit of both, but we also had an interesting discussion last night about, and it links to the last question, about you know, that kind of groundswell of pressure from communities and people calling for action, and I wonder whether we would reach a tipping point where it was really clear that there was sufficient demand from voters for there to be action. But yeah, it certainly doesn't seem that way at the moment. Yeah. So it's a really, really tricky one, and you know, the other aspect is that we need things to happen now. We can't wait 10 years for minds to be changed. So I don't have a good answer for that. Sorry.
All right. So on that note, I'd like to thank Jess for that really interesting and insightful presentation. I think bringing together two really important topics for us and for the water industry around diversity and around addressing climate change and climate adaptation. So thank you very much, Jess. Really appreciate it. Thank you. There you go. Thank you.